actually bigger than fossil fuels, then I have no doubt that we would use it to totally transform ourselves beyond recognition to something that we would probably all call inhuman, and certainly permaculture, along with most of human culture, would be in the dustbin of history. I think it's quite hopeful that this seems highly unlikely. The scenario that most people feel comfortable with, and the one promoted by mainstream environmental organisations and progressive governments around the world, I call green tech stability. This suggests we're going to use innovative renewable technologies to come down from this unstable overconsumption of resources and move into some steady state in resource consumption, maintaining most of the benefits and structures of industrial society. From a systems point of view, this transition actually seems less likely even than the first scenario. A lot of elements of this scenario might be emergent now, but for this to be stable into the future, we have to deal with a few fundamental problems, not least of which we have an economic system which is based on perpetual growth. So we would actually have to totally reform the money system to do away with this interest-bearing money that drives things constantly forward. History shows that interest-bearing money systems only seem to collapse because of external causes rather than voluntary reform. That's only one of the problems we have to deal with. The more likely scenario seems to be some sort of continuous change of reduced energy availability for successive generations. And this is an interesting scenario. It's quite different from the stability one, which is a steady state scenario really, in that the energy descent involves constant change. Now, what have we come from? We've come from the culture of modernity, which has had constant change. So that is the thing that we bring to this future, is this adaptation to constant change. Of course, there's a fourth scenario, which is a little bit difficult to see, called collapse, and there's lots of erudite books about the collapse of previous complex civilizations and the reasons for that. I really place permaculture as a creative, designed response to the energy descent future. But in the early phases of this, the strategies that are appropriate to the energy descent future are synergistic and complementary with those that are adaptive to the green tech stability. Maybe we could think of the photovoltaic panel as the icon of the green tech stability future. And we could think of the tree as the icon of the energy descent future. The key difference emerges over time, maybe over decades, maybe over generations, where if we are looking at progressively less energy availability, then we will again, future generations will become dependent on the fundamental resources of soil, water, the husbandry of land through agriculture, forestry, the resources that sustain people before industrialisation. So, how will we cope with the energy descent future, which I see in some form or another is by far the most likely of these four scenarios? Well, I took this photo in a North Carolina car yard overlooking the SUVs with their huge V8 engines to the man in the horse and cart. Now, the man in the horse and cart is an Amish gentleman, group that's rejected 20th century technology for various religious reasons. But the interesting thing is he is almost certainly a farmer. And that is perhaps emblematic of this energy descent future, and perhaps in ironic contrast to the Burger King sign in the background. So I want to briefly look at some of the spectrum of permaculture solutions before, in the second part of the presentation, move on to how this applies to the suburbs. Permaculture places a lot of focus on gardening. As I said, a lot of people see it as a form of organic gardening. The reason gardening is so important to permaculture is it's the most sustainable form of agriculture that can be practiced basically almost anywhere on the planet. It's also the most democratic way that people can provide for some of their own needs. It really doesn't require access to much land, and the skills and tools are relatively widespread, or at least they used to be. It's also, in terms of resource efficiency, it's by far the most resource efficient way to provide for perishable food close to where people live. In our own case, we've analysed the embodied water of our own garden systems, where we provide for most of our own food, and we're about 5 times more efficient than commercial agriculture in water use. In relation to some other resources, we're much, much more efficient. Now, my comparison there is not so much a criticism of what farmers are doing in their farming systems, it's what happens after the food leaves the farm gate that's the big problem. Centralised marketing systems. So gardening is also a way that people can regain this working relationship with nature. Of course, the foundation of that is living soil, which is the basis of food security for ourselves and for future generations. We use a combination of traditional organic methods such as hot composting, as well as more innovative methods such as worm farming, mulching. In the early 1980s in Australia, permaculture became so associated with mulching that many people thought permaculture was mulching. So while permaculture focuses a lot on the production side of the equation, it's equally concerned with how we redesign the consumption side of the equation. How many gardeners have had the experience of successfully growing food in the garden, but trying to get the family to eat out of the garden is a more difficult design problem? The solution to that, unfortunately, in some ways, is to start with the very young. There's Sue with her granddaughter making pasta at home. Basically, this culture of sensible, self-reliant living is one that all previous generations have learned by osmosis, not by intellectual education. Of course, one of the problems when we learn to eat from the garden, eat local food in season, is we discover, much to many people's horror, that the food supply doesn't come in a drip feed, like going to the supermarket and getting half a dozen tomatoes every week of the year. In fact, it comes in these huge pulses and scarcity. We call springtime the spring famine, actually, just as a bit of a joke. And of course, we try and even out those things by traditional